The Powder River ran cold in the hour before dawn, and Atsa Tall Cloud stood knee-deep in its current, trying to make herself small. At 6 feet 8 inches, she had spent her entire life learning the geometry of shrinking, how to fold at the shoulders, how to let her spine curve like a question mark, how to occupy less space in a world that had no room for women built like lodgepole pines. The water numbed her legs, but she did not move. In her hands she clutched James's wool coat, the one he wore the morning he died. 6 months had passed since the river swallowed him, and still she came here at dawn, as if proximity to the water might unlock the truth everyone else refused to see. The sky began to pale, bleeding gray light across the Wyoming grasslands. Atsa lifted her face toward it, feeling the cold wind touch her cheeks. She remembered how James used to find her face in the dark, his fingertips reading the angles of her jaw, the slope of her nose. He had been blind since the acid took his sight, but he always said he could see her better than anyone. "You walk like you are apologizing," he told her once, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Stop apologizing for being exactly what you are." But James was gone now, and Atsa had returned to the old habit of making herself smaller. She climbed from the river as the sun cracked the horizon, water streaming from her buckskin dress. The walk back to the ranch took 20 minutes, her long stride eating the distance between the cottonwoods and the open plain. She could see the cabin from half a mile away, a small square structure that James had built with his own hands back when he still had his sight. He had made the doorframe tall enough for her. He had made a place where she did not have to bow her head. Now the cabin stood alone against the morning sky, smoke threading from the chimney where she had left the fire banked. Atsa approached slowly, her eyes scanning the ground out of habit. Footprints. Always footprints that were not her own. Today there were more. She crouched near the fence line, studying the marks in the half-frozen mud. Boot prints, heavy and deliberate, circling the property like wolves testing a perimeter. The tread pattern was distinct, a steel groove near the heel. She had seen these prints before, 3 nights running, now always appearing after dark, always stopping just short of the porch. Someone was watching her. Someone wanted her to know she was being watched. Atsa straightened, feeling the familiar weight of isolation settle on her shoulders. In Sheridan, the town 7 miles east, people whispered when she passed. The Apache giant, the widow too tall to mourn properly. She had learned long ago not to expect help from them. The white settlers saw her as a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. And her own people, the Apache who still survived in scattered camps across the territory, had cast her out as a child. A giant woman was bad medicine, her grandmother had said, a sign of broken blood. Only James had looked at her and seen a person, a woman, someone worth loving. She crossed the yard toward the small barn where she kept her horse and a few chickens. The morning chores needed doing. Feed to scatter, water to haul from the well. Ordinary things that kept her tethered to the living world. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open, and immediately she knew something was wrong. The air smelled different, sharper, metallic. Atsa froze, every sense suddenly alert. The chickens were silent, huddled in the far corner of their coop. Her horse, a gray mare named Sage, stood rigid in her stall, ears pinned back. Then she heard it. A dry, papery sound. The whisper of scales on wood. Her eyes dropped to the pile of hay bales stacked near the door, the ones she had planned to move this morning. Coiled atop the nearest bale, tongue flicking, was a diamondback rattlesnake as thick as her wrist. Atsa's breath stopped. The snake's head swayed slowly, tracking her movement. Its rattle trembled, a sound like dried seeds in a gourd, a sound that promised death. She stood perfectly still, her mind racing. Rattlesnakes did not climb hay bales. They did not nest in barns in late autumn. This snake had been placed here, positioned exactly where she would reach when she bent to gather the hay. Someone had tried to kill her. The realization came cold and clear, followed immediately by a surge of rage so fierce it surprised her. Not fear, rage, because she was tired of being hunted, tired of shrinking, tired of measuring her life in footprints that did not belong to her. She took one careful step backward, then another, keeping her eyes on the snake. It did not strike. She reached the barn door and slipped outside, pulling it shut behind her. Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from fury. Atsa walked slowly around the barn's exterior, studying the ground. There, near the back corner, fresh prints, the same boots with the steel groove. Whoever had planted the snake had come in the night, moving quietly, knowing exactly where to place their trap. She crouched and touched the edge of one print, feeling the depth of it. A heavy man. Probably 6 feet tall, maybe 200 pounds. The stride suggested confidence, not caution. This person was not afraid of her. They should be. Atsa stood and looked toward the eastern horizon, where the road to Sheridan cut a pale line through the grass. She had avoided the town since James's funeral, unable to bear the stares, the whispers, the way people stepped aside when she approached, as if her grief might be contagious. But now she had no choice. If she wanted to survive, she needed help. And in all of Sheridan County there was only one man people said could track the truth through a blizzard of lies. Cole Rennick. She had never met him, but she had heard the stories. A surveyor for the railroad, a man who measured shadows and read the earth like other men read newspapers. Small in stature, people said, barely taller than a boy, but precise as a rifle scope. He lived alone on the edge of town, trusted by no one, needed by everyone. Atsa went back into the house and changed into her cleanest dress, a wool garment dyed deep blue that James had bought for her in Denver. She braided her hair and tied it with a strip of leather. She did not own a mirror, but she knew how she looked. Too tall, too broad in the shoulders, too Apache, too much. She saddled Sage and rode east toward Sheridan, the morning sun climbing at her back. The town appeared slowly, buildings rising from the plain like broken teeth. Sheridan was not large, maybe 300 souls, but it held the weight of civilization in this part of Wyoming. A mercantile, a land office, a saloon, a church with a bell that rang on Sundays, calling the faithful to worship a God who had never seemed particularly interested in people like Atsa. She rode down the main street, acutely aware of the eyes that followed her. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children pointed. A woman clutched her shawl tighter and hurried her daughter across the street. Atsa kept her gaze forward, her spine straight. Let them look. Let them whisper. She was done making herself small. The land office stood near the center of town, a wooden building with a painted sign that promised surveys and deeds. Atsa dismounted, tying Sage to the hitching post. She had to duck to enter through the door, the frame built for ordinary people. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk cluttered with maps and ledgers. He looked up as she entered, and his face went carefully blank, the expression of a man trying not to react. "I need to see Sheriff Quinn," Atsa said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, months of disuse making it rusty. The clerk blinked. "Sheriff's not here. What's your business?" "Someone is trying to kill me." The words hung in the air between them. The clerk shifted in his chair, glancing toward the back room as if hoping someone else would materialize to handle this situation. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Tallcloud." So he knew her name. Of course he did. Everyone in Sheridan knew the giant Apache widow. "It's the truth," Atsa said quietly. "Someone cut my fences, poisoned my well, left a rattlesnake in my barn. I need the sheriff to investigate." The clerk's expression shifted from discomfort to something harder. Dismissal. "Ma'am, I'm sure it's just prairie mischief. Kids, maybe, or drifters. Sheriff Quinn's got his hands full with real crimes." Real crimes. As if her life did not qualify. Atsa felt the old familiar weight pressing down on her, the invisible hand that had always pushed her toward the margins. She opened her mouth to argue, to demand, to insist on her right to protection under the law. But a voice from the doorway cut through the silence. "The lady's boot prints suggest otherwise." Atsa turned. A man stood in the entrance, silhouetted against the morning light. He was small, perhaps 5.5 feet tall, dressed in a canvas coat and worn trousers. He carried a leather satchel over one shoulder and a folding ruler in one hand. His hair was dark and unkempt, his face angular and weathered. But it was his eyes that caught her. Gray as river stones, sharp and measuring. Cole Rennick. He stepped into the office, his gaze not on Atsa's face but on the floor. He was studying her footprints, the ones she had tracked in from the muddy street. "You walk like someone who spent a lifetime trying not to be seen," he said, still looking down. "But your shadow is the longest I've ever measured." The clerk stood flustered. "Mr. Rennick, this doesn't concern you." "Doesn't it?" Cole finally looked up, meeting Atsah's eyes for a brief, electric moment. "A woman reports multiple attempts on her life and you dismiss it as prairie mischief. That's either incompetence or complicity. Which is it?" The clerk's face reddened. "Now you listen here, I don't have to stand for your accusations." "Then sit," Cole said mildly. He turned to Atsah. "You came looking for help. I can give it to you if you want it." Atsah hesitated. She knew nothing about this man except rumors. A surveyor, a loner, someone the roughest men in town gave a wide berth, but he was looking at her like she was a puzzle worth solving, not a problem to be dismissed. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Something flickered in Cole's gray eyes. Pain, maybe, or recognition. "Because I know what it's like to be measured by the wrong standard," he said quietly. "And because someone should." The clerk started to protest again, but Cole ignored him. He gestured toward the door. "Show me your ranch," he said. "Let me see what you're dealing with." Atsah studied him for a long moment, weighing risk against necessity. Then she nodded. They walked outside together into the harsh Wyoming sunlight. Cole moved with an odd precision, each step deliberate, as if he were constantly calculating distances. He stopped beside Sage and looked up at the mare, then at Atsah. "You'll have to ride slow," he said. "My horse is back at my camp. I'll walk alongside." "It's 7 miles. I know the distance." He smiled slightly, a brief crack in his serious expression. "I measured it." They set out west, leaving Sheridan behind. Atsah rode while Cole walked beside her, his stride efficient despite his shorter legs. For a long time neither of them spoke. The prairie spread around them in all directions, endless and indifferent. Finally Cole broke the silence. "Your husband," he said. "James Cooper. He drowned in the Powder River 6 months ago." It was not a question. Atsah's throat tightened. "Yes." "The official report said he slipped on the rocks. Lost his footing." "That's what they said." Cole glanced up at her. "But you don't believe it." Atsah's hands tightened on the reins. "James was blind, but he knew that river better than most sighted men. He fished it every week. He would never have slipped." "Then what do you think happened?" She had never said it aloud before, never dared to give voice to the suspicion that had haunted her since the day they pulled James's body from the water. "I think someone pushed him," she said. Cole nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. They walked in silence for another mile before he spoke again. "When we get to your ranch, I want to see everything. The fence cuts, the well, the snake, and I want to see the riverbank where they found him." "Why?" "Because the earth remembers things people try to forget," Cole said, "and I know how to make it talk." They reached the ranch as the sun climbed toward noon. Atsah dismounted and led Cole to the barn first, pushing open the door carefully. The rattlesnake was still there, coiled atop the hay bale, sluggish in the cool air. Cole approached slowly, crouching just outside striking range. He studied the snake without touching it, his eyes moving from the creature to the hay to the barn floor. "Brought in last night," he said. "You can see the snake's been in cold storage. It's torpid, probably kept in a root cellar until it was time to place it here." He stood and walked the perimeter of the barn, examining the walls, the door hinges, the scatter of straw on the floor. Then he knelt beside the exterior wall where Atsah had found the boot prints. Cole pulled a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He began to sketch, his hand moving quickly across the page. After a moment he looked up at Atsah. "Steel toe boots with a reinforced heel," he said. "Custom made for ranch work. Weight distribution suggests a man between 190 and 210. Stride length puts him around 6 feet tall, right-handed based on the way he approached the door." Atsah stared at him. "You can tell all that from footprints." "I can tell more than that," Cole said quietly. "I can tell he's done this before. See how the prints overlap here?" He circled the barn twice before entering, checking for witnesses. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned. He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "Show me the well." Atsa led him across the yard to the stone-lined well that James had dug their first year on the land. Cole lowered the bucket and brought up a sample of water, sniffing it carefully. His expression darkened. "Arsenic compound," he said, "mixed with lime to mask the smell. Ranchers use it to poison wolves." He looked at Atsa. "This is expensive. Whoever's doing this has resources." They walked the fence line, next Cole examining each cut, measuring the angles with his folding ruler. When they finished, he stood in the center of the yard and turned in a slow circle, taking in the entire property. "Someone wants you gone," he said flatly. "Not just scared. Gone. Dead or driven off, either one works for them." "Who?" Atsa asked, though she had her suspicions. Cole was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes distant. "There's only one man in this county with enough money and meanness to orchestrate something like this," he said finally. "Magnus Vaughn." The name fell between them like a stone into still water. Magnus Vaughn, the richest rancher in Sheridan County, maybe in all of Wyoming. A man who owned half the town and controlled the rest through debt and intimidation. A man whose power stretched back decades, whose past was whispered about but never spoken aloud. "But why?" Atsa said. "This land isn't worth much. It's barely 30 acres. "Land's always worth something to the right buyer," Cole said. "And Magnus Vaughn has wanted control of this stretch for years. Your husband knew that. It's why he registered the deed under Apache tribal protection. Federal law makes it nearly impossible to seize." Atsa felt something cold settle in her chest. "You think Magnus killed James?" "I think we need to look at where James died." They rode together to the Powder River. Atsa on Sage and Cole on a small bay gelding he retrieved from his camp. The river ran silver under the midday sun, peaceful and deceptive. Atsa dismounted at the bend where the fishermen had found James's body caught against a fallen cottonwood. Cole studied the riverbank with the same intense focus he had brought to everything else. He walked the shoreline, measuring distances, checking sight lines, examining the rocks. Finally, he climbed onto a large boulder that jutted out over the water about 12 feet above the current. He crouched there, sighting along an invisible line. "If someone stood here," he said, "they'd have a clear shot at a man fishing below. The angle matches what I'd expect from a rifle. And there's a scrape mark here in the lichen. Recent, like someone braced a gun barrel." Atsa's world tilted. "He was murdered," she whispered. "Yes." Cole climbed down from the boulder, his expression grim. "And whoever did it made it look like an accident." They stood together on the riverbank, the water rushing past, indifferent to human grief. "What do I do?" Atsa asked. Cole looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since they'd met. His eyes traveled up from the ground to her face, taking in all 6 feet 8 inches of her. "You fight," he said. "You stand your ground, and you let me help you prove what happened." Atsa wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice was possible in a world that had never offered her any. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. Cole's expression softened slightly, revealing something beneath the careful precision. "Because everyone deserves someone to stand beside them," he said. "And because I'm tired of measuring the distance between right and wrong without ever closing it." They rode back to the ranch in silence, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains. When they arrived, Cole helped Atsa tend to the horses, moving through the evening chores with quiet efficiency. As the light faded, Atsa started toward the house, then stopped. "There's something I need to show you," she said. She led Cole to the grain shed, a small outbuilding she rarely used anymore. She pushed open the door and gestured to the far corner where she had found the thing that had shattered her understanding of everything. Cole stepped inside and went still. In the corner, half buried in scattered wheat, lay a skeleton. Not a recent death. The bones were yellowed with age, but they were wrong. Too long, too large. The femur alone was nearly 3 feet, the ribcage broad enough to shelter a child. "I found it 3 days ago," Atsa said quietly, "when I was looking for seed to plant." Cole knelt beside the bones, his surveyor's eye taking in every detail. He reached out carefully, brushing dust from the pelvis, the skull. "Female," he said. died young, maybe mid-20s, and she was tall, based on femur length approximately 7 feet tall, possibly taller. Atsa's voice came out barely above a whisper. There's something else. She pointed to a tarnished silver bracelet still circling the skeleton's wrist. Cole lifted it gently, turning it to catch the last light from the doorway. Letters were engraved on the inside of the band. He read them aloud. Nyalnish Tall Cloud, 1847. The name echoed in the small shed. Atsa felt tears burn behind her eyes. Tall Cloud is my family name, she said. My grandmother's name. But I never heard of anyone called Nyalnish. Cole stood slowly, the bracelet still in his hand. His face had gone pale. 1847, he repeated. That's 38 years ago. They looked at each other across the bones of a woman who had been dead for nearly 4 decades. A woman whose skeleton told the same story as Atsa's living body. A woman too tall for the world that contained her. She was like me, Atsa said. Yes. Cole's voice was soft. And someone buried her here. In secret. Without ceremony or marker. The implications hung in the air between them, heavy and dark. Atsa knelt beside the skeleton, her hand hovering over the bones but not quite touching. She felt a connection that transcended time, a thread of recognition pulling tight across the decades. Who was she? Atsa whispered. And what happened to her? Cole was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes shadowed. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to find out. He looked at Atsa, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected. Anger, not at her, but for her, for Nyalnish, for every person who had ever been erased because they were different. Someone wanted her forgotten, Cole said. Just like someone wants you gone. This isn't random, Atsa. This is a pattern. The sun had set completely now, leaving them in darkness broken only by the pale square of the doorway. Atsa stood her joints, creaking from the cold. What do we do? She asked. Cole carefully replaced the bracelet on the skeleton's wrist, a small gesture of dignity for the dead. We dig deeper, he said. We find out who Nyalnish was, how she died, and who buried her here. Because I'm willing to bet that whoever killed her is connected to whoever's trying to kill you. They walked back to the house together, the Wyoming night vast and starlit above them. Inside, Atsa lit a lantern and put water on to boil. Cole sat at the small table pulling out his notebook and beginning to sketch his pencil, scratching across the paper. Atsa watched him work, this strange small man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a question she had not known how to ask. Thank you, she said quietly. Cole looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers across the lamplight. Don't thank me yet, he said. This is going to get harder before it gets better. Men like Magnus Vaughn don't give up their secrets easily. I know. Atsa straightened her shoulders, feeling something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but determination. But I'm done running. I'm done making myself small. Cole smiled, then a real smile that transformed his serious face. Good, he said, because the world needs more people who refuse to shrink. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the darkness, the same boots with steel grooves were probably circling another fence line, planning another threat. But inside the cabin that James built, 2 people sat together in the lamplight, and for the first time in 6 months, Atsa Tallcloud did not feel alone. The night deepened. The fire crackled. And in the grain shed, the bones of Nyalnish Tallcloud kept their silent vigil, waiting for someone to finally tell their story. Waiting for justice that was 38 years overdue. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of November dawn that turned the Wyoming grasslands into a sea of silver frost. Atsa woke to find Cole already outside, crouched near the grain shed with his measuring tools spread around him like surgical instruments. She watched from the doorway as he worked, his movements precise and methodical. He had sketched the position of Nyalnish's skeleton from 3 different angles, measured the depth of the burial, taken samples of the soil. Now he was examining something small between his fingers, holding it up to catch the early light. Coffee's ready, Otsaw called. Cole looked up, nodded, and carefully placed whatever he had been studying into a small cloth pouch. He gathered his tools and walked toward the house, his boots leaving neat prints in the frost. Inside, Otsaw poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove. Cole accepted his gratefully, wrapping both hands around the tin cup. "You didn't sleep," Otsaw observed. "Couldn't." Cole took a sip, his eyes still distant with thought. "I kept thinking about the timeline. Nalnish died in 1847, which means she was buried here before this land was even properly surveyed, before homesteading opened up this territory." He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a page covered in neat handwriting and sketches. The burial was deliberate, deep enough to avoid scavengers positioned near the foundation stones. Whoever buried her knew this spot, knew it well enough to come back in darkness and dig without being seen. Otsaw sat across from him, cradling her own cup. "What did you find out there just now?" Cole reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the cloth pouch. He opened it carefully, tipping a small object onto the table between them. A button. Tarnished brass with an ornate design pressed into the metal. "This was lodged between her ribs," Cole said quietly. "Right about where the heart would be." Otsaw felt her breath catch. She leaned closer, studying the button's design. An eagle with spread wings, clutching arrows in its talons. "Military?" she asked. "No." Cole's voice had gone hard. "Civilian, but expensive. Custom-made, the kind of thing a wealthy man would wear on a dress coat." He turned the button over, revealing faint letters stamped on the back. "There's a maker's mark, Denver, 1845. The implications settled over them like snow. "Someone killed her," Otsaw said. "And they were wealthy enough to afford custom buttons from Denver. And connected enough to bury the evidence on land they controlled." Cole looked up at her. "Otsaw, in 1847 there were only 3 men in this region with that kind of money and power. One was a railroad baron who stayed mostly in Cheyenne, one was a territorial judge who died in 1850, and one was a young cattle rancher just starting to build his empire." He did not need to say the name. Otsaw felt it settle into her bones like cold. "Magnus Vaughn." Cole nodded slowly. "He would have been about 30 years old in 1847, already wealthy from an inheritance back east, already buying up land, and already running something most people have forgotten about." He flipped to another page in his notebook where he had copied text from what looked like an old newspaper advertisement. "Vaughn's Human Curiosity Exhibition," Cole read aloud. "A traveling show featuring the wonders and oddities of the natural world. Exotic animals, strange artifacts, and the most remarkable human specimens ever assembled. On display for 1 week only in Denver, summer of 1846. Otsaw's stomach turned. "Human specimens. People born different," Cole said quietly. "Dwarfs. Conjoined twins. Anyone with a visible difference that could be turned into profit. It was common back then before the war. P.T. Barnum made a fortune doing the same thing." He looked at Otsaw, and she saw something in his eyes that made her understand why he had taken her case so quickly, why he had agreed to help without hesitation. "My sister," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lily. She was born with skeletal dysplasia, never grew past 3 feet tall. When she was 12, a showman came through our town in Missouri, offered my parents money to let Lily travel with his exhibition. They refused. The showman came back with 3 men and tried to take her anyway." His hands tightened around the coffee cup. "I was 14. I killed 2 of them with my father's rifle. The 3rd one ran. My parents sent me west before the law could hang me. I never saw Lily again. She died 6 months later from pneumonia. I wasn't there." Otsaw reached across the table, her large hand covering his smaller one. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally Cole cleared his throat and pulled his hand back, not unkindly, but with the careful distance of a man who had learned not to let anyone too close. "So, yes," he said, "I know what men like Magnus Vaughn do to people they see as curiosities. And I know what happens when someone refuses to be put on display." He tapped the button with one finger. "Nalnish was tall, Remarkably tall, exactly the kind of person Vaughn would have wanted for his exhibition. And if she refused to cooperate, or if she tried to escape, or if she threatened to expose what he was doing to the people he imprisoned. He killed her, Atsa finished, and buried her where no one would find her. Cole stood beginning to pace the small kitchen. The question is, how do we prove it? A button isn't enough. The skeleton is evidence of death, but not murder. And even if we could prove Vaughn killed Nalnish, how does that help us stop him from killing you? Atsa stood as well, moving to the window. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the frost. She could see the mountains in the distance, the big horns rising like the spine of some ancient sleeping creature. There has to be records, she said. If Vaughn ran a traveling exhibition, there would be advertisements, permits, receipts. Someone would remember. Most of those records burned in the territorial fires of 1869, Cole said. But you're right. Somewhere there's proof. We just have to know where to look. He joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his small frame. There's one other thing, he said quietly. The bracelet on Nalnish's wrist. It had your family name, Tall Cloud. Do you know anything about your grandmother's sister, an aunt who might have disappeared? Atsa shook her head. I never knew my grandmother. She died before I was born, and my mother never spoke of the family history. The Apache elders said I was cursed, that my height was punishment for some ancient sin. They didn't want to claim me as kin. Cole looked up at her, his gray eyes steady. You're not cursed, he said. You're a survivor of a bloodline someone tried very hard to erase, and that makes you dangerous to whoever wants that history to stay buried. A noise outside made them both turn. Hoofbeats approaching fast. Atsa moved to the door, Cole right behind her. She opened it to see a rider coming hard across the prairie, kicking up dust. As the horse drew closer, she recognized the animal. A paint mare from the Whitaker Ranch 3 miles south. The rider was Billy Whitaker's youngest son, a boy of maybe 16. He pulled the mare to a sliding stop in front of the porch, his face flushed with exertion. "Miss Tall Cloud," he gasped. "Ma sent me. Said to warn you. Magnus Vaughn's men were at our place this morning asking questions about you. About whether you've been causing trouble, whether you got plans to sell your land." Cole stepped forward. "What did your mother tell them?" The boy glanced at Cole, then back to Atsa. "Ma told them to get off our property. But Mr. Vaughn himself, he said to tell you that he's a patient man, but patience runs out. Said he'd be by tomorrow to make you a fair offer for your ranch." Atsa felt her jaw tighten. "Tell your mother I said thank you for the warning." The boy nodded, started to turn his horse, then stopped. "Miss Tall Cloud Ma also said to tell you something else. She said her grandmother used to talk about a Apache woman who came through these parts a long time ago. A woman tall as a tree who worked for a white man's show. Said the woman disappeared one summer and folks whispered she'd been murdered. Ma thought you should know." The boy rode off before Atsa could respond, leaving her and Cole standing in the yard. "Vaughn's moving faster than I expected," Cole said. "He knows we're asking questions. He's trying to force your hand before we can find proof." Atsa turned to look at him. "What do we do?" Cole's expression hardened into something that reminded Atsa of carved stone. "We go to Sheridan," he said. "We go to the land office and look at every property record from 1847. We find out who owned this land when Nalnish was buried, and then we start asking questions Vaughn doesn't want answered." "The land office clerk won't help us," Atsa said. "You saw how he treated me yesterday? Then we don't ask permission." Cole's smile was sharp and cold. "We break in after dark and take what we need." Atsa stared at him. "You're talking about burglary." "I'm talking about justice." Cole met her eyes without flinching. "Men like Magnus von hide behind the law because they own the people who enforce it. Sometimes the only way to fight that is to stop playing by their rules." He walked back into the house, emerging moments later with his surveying tools and a dark canvas coat. "Tonight," he said, "after the saloons close and the town goes quiet, Can you ride silently?" Atsa thought of all the nights she had moved through the prairie alone, avoiding settlements, keeping to the shadows. "Yes." "Good." Cole checked the sun's position, calculating. "Meet me at the old Hanson barn, the abandoned one on the north road, 2 hours past midnight. Bring dark clothes and a lantern with the shutters closed." "And Atsa?" "Yes." "Bring a weapon. If we're caught, Vaughn's men won't arrest us. They'll kill us and call it trespassing." The day passed slowly. Atsa tried to work mending tack and sorting through James's old tools, but her mind kept returning to the night ahead. She had never broken the law before, had spent her whole life trying to be invisible to avoid trouble. But invisibility had not saved her. Following the rules had not protected her. Maybe Cole was right. Maybe it was time to stop shrinking. As the sun set, she laid out her darkest clothing. A black wool dress, a charcoal shawl, soft moccasins instead of boots. She checked James's old pistol, the one he had kept for rattlesnakes and coyotes, 6 rounds cleaned and oiled. She looked at herself in the small hand mirror James had given her, seeing her face in fragments. Brown eyes, strong jaw, the face of a woman who had spent too long apologizing for existing. Not anymore. 2 hours past midnight, the Wyoming darkness was absolute. No moon, just stars scattered across the sky like salt spilled on black cloth. Atsa rode Sage slowly toward the Hanson barn, moving by feel and memory more than sight. Cole was already there, a shadow among shadows. He had darkened his face with ash and wore clothes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he moved, he made no sound. "Follow my lead," he whispered. "Stay low. If I signal, you freeze." "Understood." Atsa nodded. They rode into Sheridan from the north, avoiding the main street. The town slept windows dark, only a few oil lamps burning in the saloon, where the last drunks finished their whiskey. Cole led her through back alleys she had not known existed, navigating by some internal map. The land office stood silent, its door locked with a heavy padlock. Cole examined it for perhaps 10 seconds, then pulled a thin piece of wire from his coat. 20 seconds later, the lock clicked open. "Surveying isn't the only thing I learned on the frontier," he murmured. Inside the office smelled of paper and dust. Cole shuttered the lantern down to a thin beam of light, just enough to read by. He moved directly to the filing cabinets, his fingers dancing over labels. "Property deeds 1840 to 1850, he whispered. "Help me look. We need anything with Vaughn's name or anything covering your ranch's current boundaries." They worked in silence, pulling files, scanning documents. Atsa's hands shook slightly as she unfolded yellowed papers, aware that every second they spent here increased the risk of discovery. Then Cole made a soft sound, barely audible. "Found it." He spread a deed across the desk, holding the lantern close. Atsa leaned in to read. The document was dated August 1847. It transferred ownership of 200 acres, including the current location of Atsa's ranch, from the territorial government to one Magnus Vaughn for the sum of $300. But it was the notation at the bottom that made Atsa's blood run cold. Property includes existing structures and improvements, as well as one indentured servant female Apache to be retained as property of the purchaser until such time as debt is satisfied. Cole's voice was hard as iron. He didn't just kill Nyalnish. He owned her, or thought he did. Atsa felt rage building in her chest, hot and terrible. "Can we take this, use it as evidence?" "No." Cole was already carefully returning the deed to its folder. "If it goes missing, Vaughn will know someone broke in. He'll destroy everything else, but I can copy it." He pulled out his notebook and began transcribing the document word for word, his handwriting tiny and precise in the narrow beam of lantern light. A sound from outside froze them both. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the wooden sidewalk toward the land office. Cole extinguished the lantern, instantly plunging them into darkness. Atsa heard him move, felt his hand grip her arm, pulling her down behind the desk. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. A pause. Then the scrape of a key in the lock. Someone was coming in. Atsa's heart hammered so hard she thought it might be audible. Beside her, Cole was utterly still, barely breathing. Through the desk's gap, she could see a sliver of the door as it opened. A figure entered carrying a lantern. The light swung across the room and Atsa caught a glimpse of the intruder's face. Sheriff Quinn. The lawman moved through the office, slowly checking the windows, examining the filing cabinets. He seemed to be looking for something specific, or checking if anything had been disturbed. Cole's hand tightened on Atsa's arm. A warning. Do not move. Do not breathe. Quinn walked directly past their hiding spot, close enough that Atsa could smell tobacco and whiskey on his coat. He stopped at the filing cabinet they had been searching, ran his fingers along the labels. Then he pulled out the exact folder Cole had just replaced. He opened it, checking the contents. Satisfied, he returned it to the cabinet and locked the drawer with a small key he wore on a chain around his neck. "Still here?" Quinn muttered to himself. "Good." He turned and walked back toward the door, his lantern swinging. Just before he exited, he paused and looked back at the office, his eyes sweeping the darkness. For one terrible moment, Atsa thought he saw them. But then he shook his head and stepped outside, locking the door behind him. They waited in darkness for a full 10 minutes before either of them moved. Finally, Cole whispered, "He's guarding that deed." "Which means Vaughn told him to. Which means they know it's evidence." "How do we get it now?" Atsa asked. "We don't." Cole stood slowly, helping Atsa to her feet. "We go around it. We find someone who remembers what happened in 1847. Someone Vaughn can't silence." They slipped out of the office the way they had come, Cole relocking the door with practiced ease. The ride back to the Hanson barn was tense and silent. Only when they were safely away from town did Cole speak again. "Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn," he said. "Magnus's wife. She's been married to him for 40 years. If anyone knows what he did in 1847, it's her." Atsa pulled Sage to a stop. "You want me to approach Magnus Vaughn's wife? I want us both to approach her." Cole's eyes glinted in the starlight. "Because there's something else in the property records I noticed. Eleanor's maiden name was Cartwright, and in 1846 there was a marriage announcement in the Denver paper for Magnus Vaughn and Eleanor Cartwright. Want to know where they honeymooned? Where? A 6-month tour with Vaughn's traveling exhibition." Cole smiled grimly. "Eleanor was there. She saw everything. And I'm willing to bet she spent 40 years trying to forget it." They parted ways at dawn, Cole returning to his surveying camp and Atsa to her ranch. As she rode, the sun rose behind her, painting the grasslands gold. Somewhere in Sheridan, Magnus Vaughn was waking up, planning his next move, preparing to make his offer for her land. But Atsa was no longer the frightened widow waiting for death to find her. She was the great-granddaughter of Nalnish Tallcloud, a woman who had refused to be property and who had paid for that refusal with her life. And she would not let that death be forgotten. Not anymore. Eleanor Vaughn lived in a house that looked like it was trying to be a mansion, but had given up halfway. 2 stories of whitewashed wood with pretensions of grandeur, columns that supported nothing, windows too large for the Wyoming wind. It sat on the eastern edge of Sheridan like a monument to money that wanted desperately to be mistaken for class. Atsa and Cole watched the house from a stand of cottonwoods 100 yards away. It was mid-morning, 3 days after their midnight visit to the land office. 3 days of planning, watching, waiting for the right moment. "Vaughn left an hour ago," Cole said quietly, lowering the small telescope he used for surveying. "Rode south with 4 of his men. Won't be back until evening at the earliest." "And you're sure she'll talk to us?" Atsa asked. Cole folded the telescope and tucked it away. "No, but I'm sure she knows things Vaughn doesn't want anyone to know. Whether she'll share them is another question entirely." They had spent the past 3 days gathering information. Cole had talked to the old-timers in the saloon, the men who remembered Sheridan when it was just a trading post and a prayer. Atsa had visited the Whitaker ranch again, listening to Mrs. Whitaker's stories about her grandmother, about the tall Apache woman who had vanished in the summer of 1847. Every story pointed to the same conclusion. Nalnish had been real. She had been seen traveling with Vaughn's exhibition. And then suddenly, she was gone. "There's one more thing you should know," Cole said now, not looking at Atsa. "Before we go in there." "What?" "I found a birth record. Denver, March 1848. A daughter born to Magnus and Eleanor Vaughn. Name was Sarah. Died 3 days after birth according to the official record." Atsa waited, sensing there was more. "But I also found a letter," Cole continued, "tucked into a Bible I bought from a peddler who used to work for the Vaughns. The letter was from Eleanor to her sister back east, dated April 1848. In it she describes her daughter. Says the baby was beautiful but afflicted. Says Magnus wouldn't even look at her. Says he called the child a punishment from God." Cole finally turned to face Atsa, his gray eyes dark with old anger. The baby had gigantism. Even at 3 days old she was twice the size of a normal infant. And Magnus Vaughn, the man who made his fortune displaying human differences, couldn't bear to have that difference in his own family. Atsa felt something cold and terrible settle in her stomach. He killed his own daughter. The letter doesn't say that explicitly, but Eleanor writes that the baby stopped breathing in the night, and Magnus buried her before sunrise with no ceremony, no witnesses. Then he told everyone the child had been weak and sickly. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture so ugly Atsa wanted to look away. "He killed Naelnish because she was pregnant," Atsa said slowly, "with his child, a child he knew would be like her." Cole nodded. "That's my theory. The timeline fits. If Naelnish was part of his exhibition in 1846, and if Vaughn did what men like him often did to women, they considered property, then by summer of 1847 she would have been showing. He couldn't let that baby be born, couldn't risk anyone knowing he had fathered a giant child. So he killed her and buried her where no one would find her," Atsa finished. "Then married Eleanor and tried again. And when their daughter was born with the same condition, he killed her too." They sat in silence, the weight of it pressing down on them. Finally Atsa spoke. "Eleanor has lived with this for 40 years. Why hasn't she said anything?" "Because women like Eleanor don't have many choices," Cole said quietly. "Especially not 40 years ago. She's trapped in that house the same way Naelnish was trapped in Vaughn's exhibition. Just a different kind of cage." He stood brushing dust from his trousers. "But maybe she's tired of being trapped. Maybe she's been waiting all this time for someone to ask the right questions." They approached the house on foot, leaving their horses tied in the cottonwoods. Atsa felt exposed walking across the open ground, her height making her visible from half a mile away. But no one challenged them. The front door was painted a cheerful yellow that seemed obscene given what they knew happened inside. Cole knocked 3 times, firm and deliberate. Silence. Then footsteps slow and uneven. The door opened 6 inches, held by a chain. A woman's face appeared in the gap, pale and lined with age. Eleanor Vaughn looked older than her 60-some years, her hair steel gray, her hands trembling slightly with what might have been palsy or might have been fear. "Mrs. Vaughn," Cole said, removing his hat, "my name is Cole Rennick. This is Atsa Tallcloud. We need to speak with you about something that happened a long time ago." Eleanor's eyes moved from Cole to Atsa, and when she saw Atsa's height, something flickered in her expression. Recognition. Or maybe memory. "My husband isn't home," she said, her voice thin and reedy. "We know," Cole replied. "That's why we're here." Eleanor's hands tightened on the door. For a long moment Atsa thought she would slam it shut, but then something in the old woman's face changed. A decision made after years of indecision. "Wait here," she said. The door closed. They heard the chain being removed. Then the door opened fully, and Eleanor Vaughn stood aside to let them enter. The interior of the house was dim and cold despite the morning sun. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. The furniture was expensive but worn the kind of things bought to impress visitors who never came. Everything smelled of dust and loneliness. Eleanor led them to a sitting room and gestured for them to sit. Atsa had to duck through the doorway, and she saw Eleanor's eyes follow the movement, saw the old woman's lips pressed together in a thin line. "You look like her," Eleanor said abruptly. Like the woman Magnus kept. Before me. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cole leaned forward. Mrs. Vaughn, we found a skeleton buried on Miss Tallcloud's property. A woman's skeleton. Unusually tall. We believe it's Naalnish Tallcloud, who traveled with your husband's exhibition in 1846 and 1847. Eleanor closed her eyes. So someone finally found her. Atsah's breath caught. You knew she was there. I helped bury her. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. God forgive me, I helped him dig the grave. The room seemed to tilt. Atsah gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the urge to stand, to run, to escape this terrible confirmation. Cole's voice remained steady, gentle. Tell us what happened. Eleanor opened her eyes, and they were wet with tears that looked 40 years old. I met Magnus in Denver in 1846. I was 17, the daughter of a railroad investor. Magnus was handsome, wealthy, ambitious. He courted me properly, promised me a grand future. My father approved the match. She twisted her hands in her lap, the trembling worse now. The exhibition was his idea of a honeymoon. 6 months touring the territories, showing off his collection. That's what he called them. His collection. People. Human beings. A man with no legs who could walk on his hands. A woman covered in hair. Conjoined twins from Philadelphia. And Naalnish. Eleanor stood abruptly, walking to the window. She pulled the curtain back slightly, looking out at nothing. She was the star of the show. 7 feet tall, beautiful, strong as any man. Magnus had bought her from a trader who claimed she was Apache royalty. I don't know if that was true. But she had a dignity about her that all of Magnus's money couldn't touch. What happened? Cole asked quietly. Eleanor let the curtain fall. Magnus happened. He wanted her. Not as a wife, not even as a mistress. Just as something he could possess. Something rare and valuable. He went to her tent one night, and I heard her screaming. I was too much of a coward to intervene. The old woman's voice broke. After that night she changed. Became quiet, withdrawn. I tried to talk to her once, to apologize, to offer help. She looked at me and said, You are as much a prisoner as I am. We are both his property. The only difference is your cage has better furniture. Atsah felt tears burning behind her own eyes. Naalnish, her great-grandmother, speaking across the decades. By summer of 1847, it was obvious she was pregnant, Eleanor continued. Magnus was furious, not ashamed, not guilty. Furious. He said she had ruined herself, made herself unmarketable, said he would have to get rid of her. And you didn't stop him. Atsah said, her voice harder than she intended. Eleanor turned to face her, and the look on the old woman's face was devastating. I was 18 years old, 3 months pregnant myself, and terrified. Magnus told me if I said anything, if I tried to help her, he would say I was mad, have me committed to an asylum. I would never see my own child. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. I chose my baby over her. I have lived with that choice every day since. Cole stood walking to Eleanor's side. What did Vaughn do? He brought her here to the land he had just purchased, told her he was setting her free, giving her the cabin and enough supplies to start over. She believed him. She was hopeful. I saw it in her face when they rode away together. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had been clutched in her hand. He came back alone 3 days later. Told me she had tried to run, that there had been an accident, but his coat had blood on it, and there was a button missing, one of the brass ones with the eagle design. I found it later in his saddlebag. I never asked what happened to it. The button Cole had found between Naalnish's ribs, evidence of the moment Vaughn killed her. He made me help him that night, Eleanor said. Made me hold the lantern while he dug. Said if I was going to benefit from his money, I was going to share his burdens. So I stood there and watched him bury her like she was nothing, like she had never been a person at all. Atsah stood, her hands clenched into fists. And your daughter? Eleanor flinched as if struck. How did you know about Sarah? We found records, Cole said. And a letter you wrote to your sister. Eleanor sank into a chair, seeming to collapse inward. Sarah was born 9 months after Naalnish died. She was enormous. The midwife said she had never seen such a large infant. Magnus took one look at her and walked out of the room. The old woman's hands shook violently now. That night I fell asleep with Sarah in my arms. When I woke up she wasn't breathing. Magnus said she had simply stopped, that it was God's will. But I saw the pillow on the floor. I saw the way he wouldn't meet my eyes. He smothered his own daughter, Atsa said, her voice shaking. I can't prove it. I never could prove it. But I know. Eleanor looked up at Atsa with haunted eyes. And when I look at you tall and alive and standing in my house, I know that somewhere, somehow, Nyalnish's bloodline survived. That Magnus didn't manage to erase everyone who carried that gift. It's not a gift, Atsa said bitterly. It's a curse. It's made me a target my whole life. No, Eleanor stood with surprising force. It's only a curse because men like my husband made it one. Nyalnish was strong and beautiful and brave. Your height is her legacy. Don't let Magnus Vaughn make you ashamed of it. Cole cleared his throat. Mrs. Vaughn, we need your help. Magnus is trying to force Miss Tallcloud off her land. We believe he wants to eliminate any evidence of what he did to Nyalnish. Will you testify to what you just told us? Eleanor's face went pale. Testify in court. If necessary, yes. The old woman sat back down, her brief moment of strength fading. I can't. Magnus would destroy me. He controls the sheriff, half the judges in the territory. Who would believe an old woman accusing her husband of murders that happened 40 years ago? I would believe you, Atsa said quietly, because I'm living proof that everything you said is true. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to a large oak cabinet in the corner. She opened it and pulled out a small wooden box. I've kept this hidden for 40 years, she said. Never had the courage to use it. She opened the box and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. She handed them to Cole. Magnus's exhibition records, names of everyone who traveled with the show, dates, locations, letters from buyers interested in purchasing his attractions, and a contract signed by Nyalnish Tallcloud in 1846 agreeing to work for Magnus Vaughn for a period of 5 years in exchange for passage from Arizona Territory to Denver. Cole untied the ribbon with careful hands, spreading the documents across a small table. His eyes scanned quickly, then stopped. This contract, he said slowly. It was supposed to end in 1851, 4 years after she died. Yes, Eleanor said, which means when Magnus killed her she was still legally bound to him. But it also means she had every right to leave when her term was up. She wasn't his property. She was an employee with a contract. Cole looked up at Atsa. This changes everything. If Nyalnish was murdered while under contract, it's not just murder, it's a federal crime, violation of territorial labor laws. Will those laws even apply anymore? Atsa asked. After 40 years. There's no statute of limitations on murder, Cole said. And if we can prove Vaughn killed a woman who was legally protected under territorial law, we can force a real investigation, one he can't control. Eleanor sank back into her chair. Then take them. Take all of it. But don't tell anyone where you got them. I can't face him if he knows I betrayed him. Atsa knelt in front of Eleanor's chair, bringing herself down to the old woman's eye level. You're not betraying him. You're finally telling the truth, after 40 years of living with his lies. Eleanor reached out with trembling hands and touched Atsa's face, a gesture so tender it made Atsa's throat tighten. You look so much like her, Eleanor whispered. I hope you're stronger than I was. I hope you fight. I will, Atsa promised. They left the Vaughn house as quietly as they had come, the bundle of documents hidden under Cole's coat. Eleanor watched from the window as they crossed the open ground to the cottonwoods, her pale face a ghost behind the glass. She's been waiting 40 years to give those to someone, Cole said as they retrieved their horses. Waiting for someone brave enough to use them. Atsa looked back at the house one more time. What happens to her when Vaughn finds out? I don't know, Cole admitted. But I think Eleanor stopped caring about consequences a long time ago. I think she's been dead inside since the night she helped bury Nyalnish." They rode hard back toward Atsaw's ranch, the precious document secured in Cole's saddlebag. The sun climbed toward noon, hot and bright despite the November chill. They were halfway home when Atsaw saw the smoke, black smoke rising in a thick column from the direction of her ranch. "No," she breathed and kicked Sage into a gallop. Cole shouted something behind her, but she couldn't hear over the pounding of hooves and the roaring in her ears. She rode faster than she had ever ridden, pushing Sage to her limits, the prairie blurring past. The ranch came into view, and Atsaw's worst fears materialized like a nightmare made real. The cabin was burning. Flames consumed the roof James had built, the walls where she had sheltered the home that had been her last connection to the man she loved. The barn was already gone, collapsed into smoking timber, and standing in the yard watching it burn were 4 men on horseback. Magnus Vaughn sat his horse in the center, an old man with silver hair and ice in his eyes. The 3 men flanking him wore guns on their hips and smiles on their faces. Atsaw pulled Sage to a stop 50 yards away. Cole rode up beside her moments later, his hand moving to the rifle on his saddle. Vaughn turned to look at them. Even from this distance, Atsaw could see the cold satisfaction in his expression. "Miss Tall Cloud," he called out, his voice carrying across the crackling flames. "I'm afraid you had a terrible accident. Knocked over a lantern, it seems. Lucky my men were riding past and saw the smoke. Tragic that they couldn't save anything." Atsaw dismounted, her hands clenched into fists. Cole grabbed her arm. "Don't," he said urgently. "That's what he wants. A confrontation. Witnesses who can say you attacked him." But Atsaw was beyond reason. She shook off Cole's hand and walked forward, her shadow long in the firelight. "You did this," she said, her voice carrying an edge that could cut stone. "You burned my home, just like you killed Nalnish, just like you killed your own daughter." Vaughn's smile widened. "Careful, Miss Tall Cloud. Those sound like accusations. Do you have any proof?" "Yes," Atsaw said, and she saw just for a moment fear flicker across Magnus Vaughn's face. The flames behind Atsaw painted the world in shades of orange and shadow. Smoke rose into the November sky, carrying with it everything James had built, everything she had tried to preserve. But she did not turn to watch it burn. She kept her eyes on Magnus Vaughn. The old man's expression hardened, the momentary flash of fear replaced by something colder. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked toward Atsaw with the confidence of a man who had spent decades getting away with terrible things. "Proof," he said, tasting the word like it was bitter. "What proof could a half-breed squaw possibly have against a man of my standing?" Cole moved to Atsaw's side, the documents from Eleanor hidden beneath his coat. His hand rested on the grip of his pistol, not threatening, just present. "The kind that doesn't burn," Cole said quietly. "The kind that's been waiting 40 years to see daylight." Vaughn's eyes narrowed. He studied Cole with the same calculating gaze he might turn on a horse he was considering purchasing, measuring, evaluating, deciding on worth. "You're the surveyor," Vaughn said. "Rennick, I know about you. Know you killed 2 men in Missouri and ran west with blood on your hands. You think the law will listen to a murderer?" "I think the law will listen to signed contracts," Cole replied. "Employment records, letters, all documenting your traveling exhibition and everyone who worked in it, including a 7-foot-tall Apache woman named Nyalnish Tall Cloud, who mysteriously disappeared in the summer of 1847. Vaughn went very still. Behind him, his 3 hired men shifted nervously in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. "Those records burned," Vaughn said flatly. "Lost in the territorial fire of 1869. Not all of them." Cole's smile was sharp. "Some survived, kept safe by someone who knew their value." Atsaw saw understanding dawn in Vaughn's eyes, saw him turn slightly, looking east toward his own house, toward the wife he had kept silent for 40 years. "Eleanor," he breathed, and there was murder in the word. "Don't." Atsaw stepped forward, and despite the fire, despite the guns, Despite everything, she felt no fear, only rage, clean and pure and righteous. "You've killed enough people. Nalnish, your own daughter, my husband James." Vaughn's attention snapped back to her. "Your husband drowned. An accident." "You had him shot," Atsa said. Each word came out hard as stone. "Because he was a lawyer investigating Nalnish's disappearance. Because he found property records showing you owned the land where she was buried. Because he was getting too close to the truth." For a long moment the only sound was the crackling of burning timber. Then Vaughn laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling. "Prove it," he said. "Prove any of it. You have old papers about an exhibition that closed 40 years ago. You have the word of a wife everyone knows is touched in the head. And you have a skeleton that could be anyone." He stepped closer to Atsa, close enough that she could smell tobacco and old cologne. "No jury in Wyoming will convict a white man on evidence like that, especially not on the word of an Apache woman who isn't even supposed to exist." "Then why burn my house?" Atsa asked softly. "Why try to kill me with snakes and poison and threats if you're so certain I can't touch you? Why do you care what I know?" Vaughn's jaw tightened. Behind him one of his men cleared his throat. "Boss, we should go. Someone might have seen the smoke." But Vaughn did not move. He stood staring up at Atsa, and she saw something in his eyes that made her skin crawl. Not just hatred, not just fear, disgust. "You people," he said quietly. "You freaks and monsters. You think you deserve to exist, to take up space in a world that has no room for you. Your great-grandmother understood eventually, understood that nature makes mistakes and those mistakes need to be corrected." "Nalnish wasn't a mistake," Atsa said, "and neither am I." "She was an abomination," Vaughn's voice rose. "Just like my daughter. Just like every twisted creature I ever put in a cage. I gave them purpose, gave them a reason to exist. They should have been grateful." Cole spoke, then his voice cutting through Vaughn's rant. "You kept them in cages because you were terrified of them, terrified that people who were different might be stronger than you, might matter more than you, so you locked them up and told yourself you were doing them a favor." Vaughn's hand moved toward his own pistol, but Cole was faster. His gun cleared leather and a single smooth motion barrel pointed at Vaughn's chest. "Don't," Cole said simply. The three hired men drew their weapons immediately, but Cole didn't flinch. Atsa reached for James's old pistol at her belt, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. For 5 seconds they stood frozen in a tableau of violence waiting to happen. The burning cabin cast dancing shadows across them all. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Put the guns down, all of you." Sheriff Quinn rode into the yard, flanked by 2 deputies. He looked tired, older than his 50 years, a man who had made too many compromises and could feel the weight of them settling into his bones. Vaughn lowered his hand slowly, a smile returning to his face. "Sheriff, perfect timing. These 2 trespassers were just threatening me." "That's so." Quinn dismounted, his eyes moving from Vaughn to Cole to Atsa. "Funny, because I got a report about an hour ago that someone saw 4 men riding hard toward the Tall Cloud Ranch, men who matched the description of you and your crew, Mr. Vaughn." Vaughn's smile faltered. "Who reported that?" "Mrs. Whitaker. She was riding to town when she passed you on the road. Said you looked like men with bad intentions." Quinn walked to the burning cabin, studying the flames. "And now I arrive to find Miss Tallcloud's home destroyed. That's quite a coincidence." "It was an accident," Vaughn said. "My men and I were just passing by, saw the smoke, tried to help. In the middle of the day when Miss Tallcloud wasn't home." Quinn turned to face Vaughn. "When her horse is here but she isn't. When you somehow knew she wouldn't be inside." The sheriff pulled a notebook from his pocket. "I've been doing some thinking these past few days. Ever since Mr. Rennick and Miss Tallcloud started asking questions about old land deeds and property transfers, started wondering why you were so interested in 30 acres of scrub land that isn't worth much to anyone." Vaughn's face had gone very still. "Sheriff, I don't appreciate your tone." "And I don't appreciate being made a fool of," Quinn said flatly. I've known for years you had your fingers in things that weren't quite legal. Looked the other way because you paid well and kept the peace. But murder, that's different." "There's been no murder," Vaughn said. "Just wild accusations from people with grudges." Quinn walked to his horse and pulled something from his saddlebag, a leather-bound book, old and water-stained. "Found this in my father's belongings when he died last year," Quinn said. "Never paid it much attention until now. My father was a deputy in 1847, back when Sheridan was barely a settlement. He kept a journal." The sheriff opened the book, flipping to a marked page. "August 15th, 1847. Quinn read aloud. "Investigated report of screaming heard near the Vaughn property. Found nothing but fresh, turned earth and Magnus Vaughn's assurance that he had been burning brush. Something felt wrong about it. Made note to follow up." He looked up at Vaughn. "My father never got the chance to follow up. He was killed in a dispute with claim jumpers 2 weeks later, but he had good instincts, and I think he knew you buried something that day." Cole spoke quietly. "We found a skeleton on Miss Tallcloud's property. Female unusually tall, buried approximately 40 years ago. We have documentation showing a woman matching that description worked for Mr. Vaughn's traveling exhibition and disappeared in the summer of 1847. Quinn's expression didn't change. "That would line up with my father's journal entry." "This is absurd," Vaughn said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You can't seriously be considering charging me based on a 40-year-old journal entry and some bones that could be anyone." "I can get a court order to exhume the remains," Quinn said. "Have a proper examination done, and I can subpoena your exhibition records from that period." "Those records were destroyed." "Not all of them." Cole pulled the bundle of documents from beneath his coat. "Mrs. Vaughn preserved them, including a signed contract between you and Nalnish Tallcloud." Vaughn's face went white, then red. "Eleanor," he hissed, "that treacherous bitch." "Careful," Quinn said sharply. "That's your wife you're talking about. She's nothing." Vaughn's composure was cracking now, 40 years of secrets pressing against the walls he had built. "A weak, useless woman who couldn't even give me a proper heir, who helped me cover up my mistakes and then spent 40 years crying about it." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Quinn closed his notebook slowly. "What mistakes, Mr. Vaughn?" Vaughn realized too late what he had said. He stepped backward, his hand moving toward his horse. "I want a lawyer," he said. "I'm not saying another word without legal counsel." "That's your right," Quinn agreed. "But I'm going to need you to come into town with me. Answer some questions formally." "I'll do no such thing." One of Vaughn's hired men spoke up, his voice nervous. "Boss, maybe we should just go with him. Get this sorted out proper." Vaughn whirled on the man. "Shut your mouth. You work for me. All of you work for me. We're leaving, now." But none of the 3 men moved. They sat their horses looking at each other, at Quinn, at their employer who was rapidly losing the veneer of respectability that had protected him for so long. Finally, the oldest of them shook his head. "I signed on to herd cattle and keep drifters off your property, not to help cover up murders. I'm done." He turned his horse and rode away. After a moment, the other 2 followed. Vaughn stood alone, an old man watching his empire crumble. He looked at Otsaw with pure hatred. "This is your fault," he said. "You couldn't just disappear like you were supposed to, like your kind always does. You had to push, had to dig up the past." "The past never stayed buried," Otsaw said. "You just convinced yourself it did." Vaughn's hand dropped to his pistol, and for a moment Otsaw thought he would actually draw it, thought he would force this confrontation to its inevitable violent conclusion. But Quinn's voice stopped him. "Don't make this worse, Magnus. You're already facing serious charges. Don't add attempted murder to the list." Vaughn's hand trembled on the gun grip. Then slowly he let it fall to his side. "You have no idea what you've done," he said to Otsaw. "The people I'll bring down with me. The secrets that will come out. This town will tear itself apart." "Then maybe it needs to," Otsaw replied. Quinn moved forward with his deputies, pulling iron shackles from his belt. "Magnus Vaughn, I'm placing you under arrest for suspicion of murder and arson. You have the right to remain silent." The sound of the shackles clicking closed was the sweetest thing Atsa had heard in 6 months. Vaughn allowed himself to be led to Quinn's horse, his face a mask of fury, but just before they left he looked back at Atsa one more time. "She begged you no," he said conversationally, "your great-grandmother, when she realized I wasn't setting her free, when she understood what was going to happen, she begged me to spare her baby, promised she would disappear, never tell anyone. I shot her anyway." He smiled, a terrible expression devoid of humanity. "Just thought you should know." Then Quinn pulled him away, and Atsa stood watching as the man who had murdered Nyalnish, who had killed James, who had tried to erase her entire bloodline, was taken towards something that might finally be justice. Cole moved to her side, his presence steady and grounding. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Atsa looked at the burning remains of her cabin. Everything she owned was gone. The bed James built, the table where they ate together, the letters he had written her before they married describing the home he would make for them. All of it ash now. But Nalnish's bones still waited in the grain shed. The contract proving her employment still existed. The truth was finally coming to light. "No," Atsa said honestly, "but I will be." She turned to face Cole fully, this small man who had stood beside her when the whole world seemed determined to push her down. "Thank you," she said, "for believing me, for helping me fight." Cole's expression softened. "You did the fighting. I just helped you see the battlefield clearly." Behind them the cabin collapsed inward with a groan of burning timber. Atsa didn't turn to watch. She had spent too much of her life looking backward, dwelling on losses. It was time to look forward. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we prepare for the trial," Cole said. "We gather every piece of evidence. We talk to everyone who might remember anything about 1847. We build a case so strong that even a corrupt judge can't dismiss it. And Eleanor," Cole's expression darkened, "we protect her. Vaughn will try to discredit her, maybe even hurt her. We need to get her somewhere safe." Atsa nodded. Then she looked down at her hands, at the size of them, at the strength she had spent her whole life being ashamed of. "Nyalnish died protecting her unborn child," she said softly. "Died trying to give her baby a chance at life. And somehow through everything that bloodline survived. Led to me." She met Cole's eyes. "I won't let her death be meaningless. I won't let Vaughn erase what she was, who she was, even if I have to stand in front of the whole territory and let them stare." Cole reached out and took her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers. "Then I'll stand with you," he said, "for as long as it takes." The sun was setting now, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of red and gold. In the distance, Atsa could see riders approaching, Mrs. Whitaker and her sons coming to help. Word would spread fast about Vaughn's arrest. The town would talk, speculate, judge, let them. Atsa Tall Cloud stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, and for the first time in her life she was not trying to make herself smaller. She was a mountain, and mountains did not bow. The courthouse in Sheridan had never been built for moments like this. It was a modest building, wooden beams and whitewash, designed to handle disputes over cattle and water rights, not the unraveling of a 40-year conspiracy. But on the morning of December 3, 1885, every seat was filled. Atsa stood outside the courthouse doors, feeling the weight of 100 eyes. People had come from 3 counties away to witness this trial, some out of genuine interest in justice, most out of curiosity, the same impulse that had once drawn crowds to Magnus Vaughn's exhibition. They wanted to see the giant Apache woman. They wanted to watch her testify. They wanted a show. Cole stood beside her, dressed in his cleanest shirt, his surveying tools traded for a leather satchel full of documents. He had spent the past 3 weeks building their case with the precision he brought to measuring land. Every detail checked, every fact verified, every witness prepared. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Atsa looked down at her own clothing. Mrs. Whitaker had helped her sew a new dress, dark blue wool with simple lines. It fit properly, made to accommodate her height instead of forcing her to bend and fold. She wore her hair in a single long braid down her back, wrapped with a strip of leather Nalnish's skeleton had been wearing. a connection across time, a reminder of why she was doing this. "No," Atsa admitted, "but I'm going in anyway." The courtroom fell silent as she entered. She had to duck through the doorway, and the scrape of her shoulders against the frame seemed louder than it should have been. Every head turned to watch her walk to the front, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Judge Harrison Blackwood presided, a man of 60 with iron-gray hair and a reputation for fairness that Cole said was mostly deserved. He looked up from his papers as Atsa approached, and she saw his eyebrows rise slightly at her height. But he simply nodded and gestured for her to sit at the plaintiff's table. Magnus Vaughn sat across the aisle with his lawyer, a slick-tongued man named Cornelius Webb, who had been imported from Denver specifically for this trial. Vaughn looked smaller than Atsa remembered, diminished by the iron shackles on his wrists. But his eyes held the same cold hatred when he looked at her. Eleanor Vaughn sat in the front row of spectator seats, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. She had moved out of the Vaughn house the day after Magnus's arrest, taking refuge with her sister's family in town. The story had spread quickly. The wife who finally spoke, the secrets that could no longer be kept. Judge Blackwood rapped his gavel. "This court is now in session. The Territory of Wyoming versus Magnus Vaughn, charged with murder in the first degree, attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. How does the defendant plead?" Cornelius Webb stood smoothly. "Not guilty on all charges, Your Honor." "Very well. Prosecution may present opening arguments." The territorial prosecutor was a young man named Daniel Morrison, barely 30, who had volunteered for this case when the older attorneys mysteriously developed scheduling conflicts. He stood clutching his notes, visibly nervous. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, this case concerns events that began 40 years ago when a woman named Nalnish Tallcloud was employed by the defendant to work in his traveling exhibition. We will prove that Mr. Vaughn murdered Miss Tallcloud in August of 1847 and buried her body on land he owned. We will further prove that he has spent the past 4 decades covering up this crime, and that when Miss Atsa Tallcloud Nalnish's great-granddaughter began investigating, he attempted to murder her as well." Morrison's voice grew steadier as he spoke, finding his rhythm. "We will present physical evidence, documentary evidence, and eyewitness testimony from someone who was there the night Nalnish Tallcloud was buried. This is not a case about events lost to time. This is a case about a powerful man who believed he could commit murder with impunity because his victims were people society had deemed unworthy of protection." He sat down. Cornelius Webb rose immediately, his smile confident. "Your Honor, the defense will show that this case is built on speculation, hearsay, and the malicious fantasies of people with axes to grind against a pillar of this community. Mr. Vaughn is a respected businessman who has contributed immeasurably to the development of Wyoming Territory. The prosecution has a skeleton of unknown origin, some old papers of questionable authenticity, and the word of a bitter wife seeking revenge for decades of imagined slights." Webb gestured dismissively toward Atsa. "They also have Miss Tallcloud, who claims relation to a woman who disappeared 40 years ago based on nothing but a shared surname and similar physical characteristics. This is not evidence, Your Honor. This is a witch hunt." Judge Blackwood nodded. "Noted. Prosecution, call your first witness." Morrison stood. "The Territory calls Cole Rennick." Cole took the stand, was sworn in, and sat with the same calm precision he brought to everything. Morrison led him through his credentials as a surveyor, established his expertise in analyzing physical evidence and terrain. "Mr. Rennick, please describe what you found when you examined the burial site on Miss Tallcloud's property." Cole pulled out his notebook, though Atsa suspected he had memorized every detail. "On November 8th, I examined a skeleton discovered in a grain shed on the property currently owned by Miss Atsa Tallcloud. The skeleton was female, approximately 6 feet 6 inches tall, based on bone measurements buried approximately 38 to 40 years ago, based on soil compaction and decomposition patterns." He continued, methodically describing the position of the body, the depth of the grave, the presence of the brass button lodged between ribs 4 and 5. "The button matches those worn on dress coats manufactured in Denver, between 1844 and 1847. The maker's mark confirms this. The position of the button combined with the angle of the ribcage damage suggests the victim was stabbed or shot at close range. Webb stood for cross-examination, his smile sharp. "Mr. Rennick, you're a surveyor, not a medical examiner. How can you possibly determine cause of death from old bones?" "I can't determine exact cause of death," Cole admitted, "but I can analyze physical evidence and draw logical conclusions based on observable facts." "Logical conclusions? How convenient." Webb paced in front of the witness stand. "Tell me, Mr. Rennick, is it true you fled Missouri in 1871 after killing 2 men? The courtroom erupted in whispers. "Webb, unless you have questions relevant to this case, move on." Webb changed tactics. "This button you found, how can you prove it came from Mr. Vaughn's coat?" "I can't prove definitively it was his specific coat," Cole said, "but I can prove it matches the style and manufacture of buttons he wore during that period, and I can prove it was embedded in the rib cage of a woman buried on his property during the time frame when Nalnish Tallcloud disappeared while in his employment." The questioning continued for another hour, Webb trying to poke holes in Cole's analysis, Cole calmly defending his conclusions with data and logic. When Cole finally stepped down, Atza could see exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, but his testimony had held firm. Morrison called a series of witnesses. The town doctor who examined Nalnish's skeleton and confirmed Cole's assessment of her height and approximate age at death. Mrs. Whitaker, who testified about her grandmother's stories of the tall Apache woman who disappeared, a former stable hand who remembered working briefly for Vaughn in 1847 and seeing a pregnant native woman living in a cabin on Vaughn's land. Each piece of testimony added another brick to the foundation Morrison was building. Then, as afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows, Morrison called the witness everyone had been waiting for. "The territory calls Eleanor Vaughn." The courtroom fell absolutely silent as Eleanor made her way to the witness stand. She moved slowly, her hands trembling, but her voice was steady when she swore her oath. Morrison approached gently. "Mrs. Vaughn, how long have you been married to the defendant?" 42 years. "And during that time has your husband ever discussed his traveling exhibition with you?" "Yes." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "It was how we met. In Denver in 1846. He was organizing a tour of the territories." "Did you travel with that exhibition?" "I did. For 6 months as his fiancée and then his wife." Morrison pulled out one of the documents from Eleanor's box. "Is this a roster of people employed by your husband's exhibition?" Eleanor looked at the paper, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes." "Please read the name I've highlighted. Nalnish Tallcloud, Apache, 7 feet tall, employed June 1846. The courtroom erupted in whispers again. Judge Blackwood gavelled for silence. Morrison continued carefully. "Mrs. Vaughn, did you know Nalnish Tallcloud?" "Yes." Eleanor's voice cracked. "She traveled with us. She was kind to me even when I didn't deserve her kindness." "What happened to her?" Eleanor took a shaking breath. Across the aisle, Magnus Vaughn leaned forward, his eyes locked on his wife with an intensity that made Atza's skin crawl. "Don't," Vaughn said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Eleanor, don't do this." Judge Blackwood slammed his gavel. "Mr. Vaughn, you will remain silent or I will have you gagged. This is your only warning." Eleanor looked at her husband, and something passed between them. 40 years of fear of complicity, of living with terrible knowledge. Then Eleanor turned away from him and looked at Atza instead. "He killed her," Eleanor said clearly. "My husband murdered Nalnish Tallcloud in August of 1847, and I helped him bury her body." The courtroom exploded. Judge Blackwood hammered his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, threatening to clear the room. It took 5 minutes for the chaos to subside. When silence finally returned, Morrison asked the question everyone needed answered. "Mrs. Vaughn, why didn't you come forward sooner?" Eleanor's tears were flowing freely now. "Because I was a coward. Because I was 18 years old and pregnant and terrified. Because Magnus told me if I ever spoke about it, he would have me committed to an asylum and I would never see my child." And then when our daughter was born, and she had the same condition as Nialnish, the same unusual size, I watched my husband smother her in her crib, and I knew that if he could kill his own child, he could kill anyone. The words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through the entire courtroom. Atsa saw people's faces change, saw the moment when Magnus Vaughan transformed from respected businessman to monster in their eyes. Morrison let the silence stretch, then asked quietly, "Can you describe what happened the night Nalnish died?" Eleanor did. She described how Magnus had returned to their camp near the Powder River, blood on his coat, how he had forced her to ride with him in darkness to the property he had just purchased, how she had held a lantern while he dug. "She was already dead when we got there," Eleanor said. "He had left her body hidden in the brush. I saw her face in the lantern light. She looked peaceful, like she was just sleeping." "Did your husband say why he killed her?" "He said she had ruined herself, that she was pregnant with his child and he couldn't allow that child to be born. He said giants were abominations that shouldn't exist." Eleanor looked directly at Atsa. "He said the same thing about our daughter 3 years later, right before he killed her too." Cornelius Webb stood for cross-examination, but for the first time his confidence seemed shaken. "Mrs. Vaughan, isn't it true that you've been estranged from your husband for many years?" "We lived in the same house," Eleanor said. "That's not the same as being married." "And isn't it true that you stand to inherit a considerable sum if your husband is convicted?" "I don't want his money," Eleanor said flatly. "I want to be able to sleep at night, something I haven't done in 40 years. Webb pressed her for inconsistencies, tried to paint her as a spurned woman seeking revenge, but Eleanor's testimony never wavered. She had carried this truth too long to let it be twisted now. When she finally stepped down, she didn't return to her seat. Instead, she walked directly out of the courtroom, her back straight, a woman who had finally set down a burden too heavy to carry. Judge Blackwood adjourned for the day. As people filed out, buzzing with conversation, Atsa remained seated, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. Cole appeared at her side. "Tomorrow they'll call you to testify. Are you ready?" Atsa thought about Nialnish murdered for the crime of being different, about James killed for seeking truth, about all the years she had spent trying to disappear to take up less space to apologize for existing. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." That night Atsa stayed with the Whitakers, unable to face the burned ruins of her ranch. She lay awake in the guest room, listening to the wind against the windows, thinking about what she would say tomorrow. The testimony that would either condemn Magnus Vaughan or set him free. The words that would either validate Nalnish's existence or consign her to forgotten history. Just before dawn, Atsa finally slept, and in her dreams she saw a woman 7 feet tall walking through tall grass under a wide sky. The woman turned and smiled, and Atsa saw her own face reflected back. Not cursed, not broken, just strong. When morning came, Atsa woke to snow falling against the window. The second day of trial. The day she would speak not just for herself, but for Nialnish, for James, for every person the world had tried to erase. She dressed in the same blue wool dress now worn twice in pursuit of truth. The fabric felt different today, not like armor but like a second skin. She was not dressing to impress, she was dressing to testify. Outside, the snow muffled the sounds of Sheridan waking. Atsa walked to the courthouse alone, each footprint she left in the fresh snow, a declaration: I was here. I existed. I mattered. The trial would continue. And this time the world would listen. The second day of the trial began with snow. Not the heavy, wet snow of deep winter, but the first light flakes of December drifting through the gray morning like fragments of ash. Atsa watched them fall as she walked to the courthouse, each one melting the moment it touched the ground. Nothing lasted. Everything changed. Even testimony given under oath would fade from memory eventually. But the truth once spoken could never be completely erased. The courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. Word had spread about Eleanor's testimony, and now people packed the aisles, stood against the back wall, pressed their faces to the windows. They had come to see the giant woman speak, to hear her claim her place in a story that had tried to write her out entirely. Judge Blackwood gavelled the room to order. "Prosecution, call your next witness." Daniel Morrison stood straightening his coat. "The territory calls Atsa Tallcloud." Atsa rose. The room fell silent as she walked to the witness stand, her footsteps deliberate, her spine straight. The bailiff had to fetch a box for her to stand on so her hand could reach the Bible for the oath. The absurdity of it, making accommodations for her height in a trial about a woman murdered for that same height, was not lost on anyone. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." She sat, and even seated she was taller than most of the men in the room. She looked out at the sea of faces, found Cole's steady gray eyes, and felt her breathing calm. Morrison approached with careful respect. "Please state your name for the record." "Atsa Tallcloud." "And your age?" 28 years. "Miss Tallcloud, how did you come to own the property where Naalnish Tallcloud's remains were discovered?" "My husband James Cooper purchased it in 1883. We built a cabin there together. He died 6 months ago." "How did your husband die?" Atsa's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "He drowned in the Powder River. The official report said it was an accident. I believe he was murdered." Cornelius Webb was on his feet immediately. "Objection. Speculation. There's no evidence of foul play in Mr. Cooper's death." "Your Honor," Morrison countered, "we intend to show a pattern of behavior by the defendant." Judge Blackwood considered. "I'll allow it, but keep it relevant, Mr. Morrison." Morrison nodded. "Miss Tallcloud, why do you believe your husband was murdered?" "Because James was a lawyer. He was investigating historical property records, trying to trace the chain of ownership for our land. He found discrepancies in the deeds from 1847. He told me he thought something had been buried there, both literally and figuratively." Atsa met Morrison's eyes. 3 days later he was dead. "Did he tell you what specifically he had found?" "He said there was a transfer of land from Magnus Vaughan to a holding company in 1848, just after Naalnish disappeared. The transfer was unusual because it included language about disposing of previous encumbrances. James thought that was legal code for covering up something." Morrison walked to the evidence table and picked up a document. "Is this the deed your husband found?" Atsa examined it. "Yes, he had made a copy for his files." "And where was your husband when he died?" "Fishing on the Powder River at a bend about a mile from our property. He fished there every week. He knew every rock, every current, even though he was blind." A murmur went through the courtroom. Morrison let it settle before continuing. "Your husband was blind." "Yes, Magnus Vaughan had him attacked in 1884. 3 men threw acid in his face when James was leaving the Denver courthouse after filing papers related to our land purchase. The attackers were never caught." Webb objected again, but Judge Blackwood overruled him. The pattern Morrison was establishing was becoming impossible to ignore. "Miss Tallcloud," Morrison said gently, "when did you first learn about Naalnish?" "I found her skeleton by accident in the grain shed on our property. She was wearing a bracelet with her name engraved on it. Tallcloud is my family name, but I had never heard of her." "What did you do when you found the remains?" "I asked Cole Rennick to help me investigate. He examined the burial site and determined she had been murdered. Then we started looking into Magnus Vaughan's history." Morrison led her through the investigation, the documents they had found, the conversations with Eleanor. Atsa spoke clearly, precisely, holding nothing back. She described the cut fences, the poisoned well the rattlesnake planted in her barn. "Why do you believe Mr. Vaughan targeted you specifically?" Morrison asked. Atsa looked across the courtroom at Magnus Vaughan. He stared back at her with undisguised hatred. "Because I'm proof that his attempt to erase Naalnish's bloodline failed," she said. "Because every time he looks at me, he's reminded of what he did. And because as long as I'm alive and asking questions, his secret can never be safe." Morrison returned to the evidence table. "Miss Tallcloud, I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. I'm going to show you the bracelet found on Naalnish's remains. Can you tell us what the inscription says?" He handed her the tarnished silver band. Atsa turned it slowly in her large hands, reading the words engraved inside. Nalnish Tall Cloud, beloved daughter, born 1823. Beloved daughter, Morrison repeated. Not monster, not abomination, not freak, daughter, a person who was loved. Atsa felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. Yes. No further questions, Your Honor. Cornelius Webb stood buttoning his jacket with theatrical precision. He approached Atsa like a predator circling prey. Miss Tallcloud, you claim to be Nalnish's great-granddaughter. Can you prove this relationship? I have the same physical characteristics, the same family name, oral history from Apache elders who remember stories about her. Oral history. Stories. Webb smiled. Not exactly scientific proof, is it? Have you had your blood tested? Any medical examination to confirm genetic relationship? No. So you could simply be a tall Apache woman with a common surname claiming connection to a murder victim to gain sympathy and attention. Atsa's jaw tightened. Why would I want attention? I've spent my entire life trying to avoid it. Have you? Webb's smile widened. Or have you spent your life resenting the world for treating you differently, building up anger and blame that you're now directing at my client? Objection, Morrison called. Argumentative. Sustained. Mr. Webb, ask questions, don't make speeches. Webb paced in front of the witness stand. Miss Tallcloud, isn't it true that you're simply a bitter widow looking for someone to blame for her misfortunes, that you've latched onto this old skeleton and built an entire fantasy around it? No. Atsa's voice was hard as stone. I'm a woman whose husband was murdered for asking questions, whose home was burned, who was targeted for death by a man who has spent 40 years hiding his crimes. Allegedly targeted, allegedly murdered. You have no proof of any of this. I have a rattlesnake that didn't get into my barn by accident. I have well water poisoned with compounds only ranchers use. I have boot prints circling my property every night for weeks. And I have Cole Rennick's analysis showing my husband couldn't have drowned where they found his body unless someone put him there. Webb switched tactics. Let's talk about Mr. Rennick. You've developed quite a close relationship with him, haven't you? He's helped me investigate. Is that all? Or is there a more personal connection? A romantic involvement, perhaps? Morrison stood. Objection. Relevance. Your Honor, I'm establishing potential bias. Miss Tallcloud may have been influenced by Mr. Rennick's own vendetta against successful businessmen. Judge Blackwood frowned. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Webb. Webb turned back to Atsa. Are you and Mr. Rennick romantically involved? Atsa felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met Webb's eyes steadily. We're friends. He's the first person in years to treat me like a human being instead of a curiosity. If that's what you mean by involvement, then yes. How convenient that he appeared in your life right when you needed someone to validate your accusations. I sought him out, Atsa said, because people said he was honest, that he found truth others missed, and he has. Webb spent another hour trying to break her testimony, looking for contradictions, suggesting alternative explanations for everything. But Atsa had lived with these truths too long to let them be twisted. When she finally stepped down, she felt hollowed out, exhausted, in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. Cole was waiting as she returned to her seat. You did well, he whispered. Morrison called 2 more witnesses, a geological expert who confirmed Cole's timeline for the burial, a handwriting analyst who verified the signatures on the exhibition contracts. Then Morrison stood and said the words that made the entire courtroom hold its breath. The territory rests, Your Honor. Judge Blackwood nodded. Mr. Webb, does the defense wish to present witnesses? Webb conferred with Vaughn in whispers. Magnus shook his head sharply. After a moment, Webb stood. The defense calls no witnesses, Your Honor. We move for dismissal on grounds of insufficient evidence. Motion denied. We'll proceed to closing arguments tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and people began filing out, their voices rising in speculation and debate. Atsa remained seated, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. Cole touched her arm gently. Come on, let's get some air. They walked out into the December afternoon. Snow was falling more heavily now, coating the street in white. The world looked clean new, as if the ugliness of the trial couldn't touch it. "Do you think we have enough?" Atsa asked. "Enough to convict him?" Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I think we have the truth. Whether that's enough depends on 12 people we've never met." That night, unable to sleep, Atsa walked to the edge of town where Cole kept his surveying camp. She found him awake, sitting by a small fire, staring into the flames. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked as she approached. "Too many thoughts." Cole shifted, making room for her by the fire. She sat, and for a while they were silent, watching the snow fall through the firelight. Finally, Cole spoke. "Win or lose tomorrow, you did something important. You made sure Nalnish's story was told, made sure she wasn't forgotten. If he's acquitted, it won't matter. He'll still be free, still be powerful." "It will matter," Cole said firmly, "because everyone knows now. Even if the law doesn't punish him, history will remember, and that's its own kind of justice." Atsa looked at him. This small man who had stood beside her when he had no obligation to, who had risked his own safety to help her find truth. "Why did you really help me?" she asked. "The truth." Cole met her eyes, and in the firelight she saw pain there, old and deep. "Because when my sister died, no one cared. She was just another freak, another oddity. The world moved on like she had never existed. And I swore that if I ever had the chance to make sure someone like her was remembered, I would take it." He looked away, his voice roughening. "Nalnish deserved better than to be buried in secret and forgotten. You deserve better than to spend your life apologizing for existing. And maybe if I can help make that happen, my sister's death won't have been completely meaningless." Atsa reached out and took his hand. Not romantically, just two people who understood what it meant to be different in a world that demanded conformity. They sat together until the fire burned low, then walked back to town through the snow-covered streets. The next morning the courtroom was so packed that Judge Blackwood had to station deputies at the doors to prevent more people from entering. Morrison delivered his closing argument with quiet passion, walking the jury through the evidence piece by piece. The skeleton, the contracts, Eleanor's testimony, the pattern of violence against anyone who asked questions. "Magnus Vaughn is a man who has spent 40 years believing he was above the law," Morrison concluded. "He killed a woman because she was inconvenient. He killed his own daughter because she didn't meet his standards of perfection. And he tried to kill Atsa Tallcloud because she dared to seek justice for her ancestor. The question before you is simple. Will we allow powerful men to commit murder with impunity? Or will we say that in Wyoming every life matters regardless of wealth, status, or physical appearance?" He sat down. Webb stood immediately, his closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, the lack of direct witnesses to Nalnish's murder, the questionable reliability of Eleanor's testimony, the circumstantial nature of the evidence. "You cannot convict a man based on 40-year-old bones and the word of a bitter wife," Webb argued. "The prosecution wants you to believe their narrative, but narratives aren't proof. Proof requires certainty, and there is no certainty here." The jury filed out to deliberate. Atsa, Cole, and Morrison waited in a small room adjacent to the courthouse. Minutes stretched into hours. Finally, after 6 hours, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom reassembled. The snow had stopped, and pale winter sunlight streamed through the windows. The jury foreman stood a weathered rancher named Thomas Creek. Judge Blackwood addressed him formally. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "In the matter of the territory of Wyoming versus Magnus Vaughn on the charge of murder in the first degree of Nalnish Tallcloud, how do you find—" Creek's voice carried through the silent courtroom. "We find the defendant guilty." The room erupted. Judge Blackwood hammered his gavel, calling for order. "On the charge of attempted murder of Atsa Tallcloud, how do you find guilty?" "On the charge of arson, guilty." Each verdict fell like a hammer blow. Atsa watched Magnus Vaughn's face drain of color, watched him sag in his chair as if the words had physical weight. Judge Blackwood thanked the jury and set sentencing for the following week. As deputies led Vaughn away in shackles, he turned one last time to look at Atsa. "It should have been you in that grave," he said, his voice venomous. You and your whole cursed bloodline. But it wasn't, Atsa replied quietly. And now everyone will remember why. Vaughn was dragged away, still shouting obscenities. Atsa felt Cole's hand on her shoulder, heard Morrison congratulating them, but it all seemed distant, muffled. Justice. After 40 years, justice. It didn't bring James back, didn't rebuild her cabin, didn't erase the years of pain. But it was something. As the courtroom began to empty, Eleanor Vaughn appeared in the doorway one last time. She moved slowly through the crowd, her hand clutching a small envelope yellowed with age. She approached the evidence table where Morrison was gathering his papers. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, her voice barely audible above the murmur of dispersing spectators. Something I should have given you during the trial, but I was too frightened. She handed Morrison the envelope. He opened it carefully, pulling out a single sheet of paper covered in careful, precise handwriting. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. Morrison read aloud, his voice cutting through the noise. To whoever finds me, my name is Nalnish Tallcloud. I carry Magnus Vaughn's child, and I know he means to kill us both. He promised me freedom, a cabin, a new life. But I have seen the way he looks at me now that my belly swells, the same way he looked at the others who displeased him, with disgust, with murder. If you read this, it means I am dead. Please, I beg you, find my child. For I know in my heart she will be a daughter, tall like me, strong like me. Tell her that being different is not a curse, it is a gift her mother gave her with her last breath. Tell her to stand tall always. Tell her I loved her before I ever held her. My name is Nalnish Tallcloud, and I existed. I mattered. Remember me. Written this 10th day of August, 1847. The courtroom, half empty now, fell completely silent. Those who remained stood frozen, the weight of a voice from 4 decades past settling over them like snow. Eleanor looked at Atsa, tears carving paths down her lined face. The baby survived, she whispered. I didn't know until years later, but a midwife was there that night. She heard Nalnish screaming. After Magnus left, the midwife found Nalnish's body and cut the baby free. A girl child, impossibly large but breathing. The midwife raised her in secret, far from here, told everyone the baby was her own. That child was your grandmother, Atsa. Eleanor reached out and placed the letter in Atsa's hands. You are not just similar to Nalnish. You are her blood, her daughter's daughter's daughter. She died so you could live. And you made sure she was not forgotten. Atsa held the letter, her hands trembling. Nalnish's handwriting, Nalnish's words, Nalnish's love reaching across time. Thank you, Atsa said, though the words felt too small for what she meant. Eleanor nodded and turned to leave. At the doorway she paused and looked back one final time. Stand tall, Atsa Tallcloud, for all of us who never could. Then she was gone. That afternoon, Atsa rode out to her property alone. The burned ruins of the cabin stood like a monument to everything that had been lost. But next to it, untouched by fire, was the grain shed where Nalnish had waited so long to be found. Atsa entered and knelt beside the bones. The skeleton had been photographed, documented, used as evidence. Soon it would be returned to her for proper burial. I kept my promise, Atsa said softly. Your story was told. The man who killed you will die in prison. You're not forgotten anymore. The wind whispered through gaps in the wooden walls, sounding almost like a voice, almost like gratitude. Atsa stood brushing dust from her dress. She looked out through the open door at the land James had loved, the land Nalnish had died trying to protect. It was hers now, truly hers, not because a dead husband left it to her, but because she had fought for it, because she had refused to disappear. Spring would come. She would rebuild, not the same cabin, but something new, something with doorways tall enough to walk through without bowing, something that celebrated height instead of apologizing for it. And she would bury Nalnish properly with Apache rights, with the dignity she had been denied in death. The sun was setting as Atsa rode back to town. She passed the courthouse, saw people still gathered outside discussing the verdict. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with respect, some with the same old fear and disgust. Let them look. She was done caring. At the Whitaker Ranch, Mrs. Whitaker had prepared dinner. The family gathered around the table, and for the first time in months, Atsa felt something like peace. After dinner, Cole appeared at the door. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing her a newspaper. The headline read, "Giant Killer Convicted. Justice Served After 40 Years." Beneath it was a sketch of Atsa standing in the courtroom, tall and unbowed. The article told Nalnish's story, told of her strength, her courage, her refusal to be property. It mentioned Atsa's determination to seek justice, Cole's meticulous investigation, Eleanor's brave testimony. The reporter had gotten some details wrong, but the essential truth was there printed in ink that would be read across the territory and beyond. Nalnish Tallcloud had existed. She had mattered. She would be remembered. "It's a start," Cole said quietly. Atsa looked at him, this man who had helped her find her voice. "What will you do now? Go back to surveying?" Cole smiled slightly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll help you rebuild your cabin. Make sure the measurements are right. That could take months. I've got time." They stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear December sky. Somewhere in those stars, Atsa liked to think Nalnish was watching, and maybe James too. She had lost so much. Her husband, her home, years of her life spent hiding. But she had gained something too. The knowledge that she was part of a legacy of strength. That her height was not a curse but a connection to a woman who had refused to be broken. And she had gained Cole. Not as a husband, not yet, but as something equally valuable. A friend who saw her completely and chose to stand beside her anyway. Winter deepened over Wyoming, but spring would come eventually. It always did. And when it came, Atsa Tallcloud would be ready, standing tall, casting a shadow like a mountain, exactly as she was meant to be. Exactly as she was meant to be. 6 weeks after the verdict, the Wyoming Territorial Gazette ran 3 stories on the same page. The first headline read, "Sheriff Quinn Resigns Amid Corruption Investigation." The article detailed how Quinn had accepted payments from Magnus Vaughn for nearly 2 decades, destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses. He would not face criminal charges due to lack of direct proof, but his career in law enforcement was over. The second story was shorter. 3 men sentenced for arson in Tallcloud case. The hired hands who had burned Atsa's cabin received 2 years each in territorial prison. When asked if they had anything to say, the oldest of them replied only, "We should have known better than to follow a man who hated his own blood." The third headline made Atsa cry when she read it, "Vaughn Estate Donated to School for Exceptional Children." Eleanor Vaughn had moved east to Pennsylvania to live with her sister's family. Before leaving Sheridan, she had signed over the entire Vaughn property and fortune to establish a school where children with physical differences could learn without shame or fear. The announcement quoted from her founding charter, "Let this be a monument to Sarah Vaughn, the daughter I could not save, and to Nalnish Tallcloud, the woman whose courage I should have matched. May every child who walks through these doors know that being different is not a curse. It is a gift." Eleanor had enclosed a personal letter with the legal documents. Atsa read it by lamplight in her rebuilt cabin, smaller than James's original, but with 9-foot ceilings and doorways she could walk through without bowing. "Dear Atsa," the letter began, "I am a coward who found courage too late, but you were brave when it mattered most. The school will open next fall. I have asked that the library be named for Nalnish, and the first scholarship be given in your honor. You need not accept it or acknowledge it. I ask nothing from you. I only wanted you to know that some of us do learn eventually to stand for what is right, even if it takes 40 years. With deepest respect, Eleanor." Cole looked up from the plans he was sketching for Atsa's barn. "Good news. Complex news," Atsa said. She handed him the letter. "But I think yes, good." That spring, on a morning when the prairie grass had turned green and the Powder River ran clear, Atsa and Cole buried Nalnish's remains on a small rise overlooking the ranch. An Apache medicine man from a camp 2 territories away had agreed to perform the rites. He was old, nearly blind, but his voice was strong. "Your people cast you out. he said, speaking to Nalnish's spirit, "but the spirits do not cast out the different. They celebrate them. You were a warrior. You died protecting your child. That child's blood lives on. Walk in peace now, tall one. Walk in peace." They marked the grave with a stone Cole had carved himself. Nalnish Tall Cloud, born 1823, died 1847. Beloved daughter, beloved mother, she stood tall when the world demanded she bow. Her shadow reaches us still. Beside it a smaller stone for James Cooper, born 1853, died 1885. He built a home where love could stand at full height. He saw with his heart what others missed with their eyes. On the day Magnus Vaughan died in territorial prison, February 18, 1886, exactly 40 years to the day after he had murdered Nalnish, the warden noted that Vaughan's last words were, "They should never have existed." When word reached Sheridan, Atsa was helping Cole frame the new barn. She heard the news from Mrs. Whitaker, who had ridden out specifically to tell her. "He's dead then," Atsa said quietly. "He is. Died alone, hated, forgotten." Atsa looked at the grave markers on the hill. "Good. Because Nalnish is remembered, James is remembered, and I am still here." That evening, as the sun set over Hart Ridge, Atsa stood at her full height and looked at the land she had fought to keep. The cabin with its tall doors, the barn Cole was building, the grave where Nalnish finally rested in dignity. She was 29 years old, 6 feet 8 inches tall, Apache, a widow, a survivor, a woman who had taken on a powerful man and won. And she was not done living. Cole walked up beside her, paint still on his hands from marking the barn timber. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Nalnish spent her whole life in cages, real ones and invisible ones, and I spent mine trying to shrink." Atsa smiled, watching the sun paint the clouds gold and crimson. "But that stops now." "Good," Cole said simply. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other because the world had tried to make them both disappear. In the distance a coyote called. The wind moved through the grass like water, and somewhere in the fading light, Atsa thought she could feel it. Nalnish's spirit finally free, finally at peace. The shadow of a giant woman cast across 4 decades, reaching forward into a future where being different was no longer a death sentence, where standing tall was not an apology, where existence itself was victory enough. The end.